In a quaint village nestled between jagged mountains and whispering woods, where sunlight would usually bath the cobblestone streets in a warm glow, the sun set abruptly, casting eerie shadows that twisted and turned like gnarled fingers grasping towards the sky. The villagers, who were once filled with laughter and cherished stories, fell silent as a chilling wind snaked through the homes, bringing with it an unsettling sense of foreboding that had begun to wrap its tendrils around the hearts of every villager. Bushy clouds veiled the moon, cloaking the village in a deeper darkness, as the day surrendered to the mysterious embrace of night. They had heard the tales, often whispered in frightened tones, about a malevolent figure lurking in the depths of this ominous night. Among the villagers lived a young boy named Thomas. His big bright eyes sparkled with curiosity, always wide open to the world around him. He loved to listen to the stories told by the village elders, stories full of excitement, caution, and magic. They spoke of a dark figure, a sinister monk draped in cloaks far too large for any human body, whose mere presence offered a cold chill that seemed to seep into the air. This malevolent specter roamed not just to wander the quiet pathways of the village. He came seeking lost children, stealing them away in the dark and leaving behind only sorrowful silence and heartache. Thomas had often dismissed these chilling tales, chalking them up to the exaggerations of old men too afraid to face the realities of their fading youth. But even he found himself trembling as twilight approached, drawn to his bed as if possessed by an invisible force, listening intently for any sounds beyond the reassuring creaks of his home. That night, as the darkness wrapped itself around his quiet room, an unusual sound caused Thomas to sit bolt upright, his heart pounding hard against his ribcage. It was a guttural whisper, floating through the still air, barely discernible yet laden with an unsettling intensity that seemed to seep into his bones. He strained to listen, the words coiling around him like fog on a chilly night. "Thomas," the whisper urged, a rusty voice simmering with malice, "come to me." It echoed from outside his window, compelling and sinister, sending prickles of fear racing down the back of Thomas's neck. Was it just the wind teasing his ears, or could it be the dark monk come at last? His skin prickled, and the hairs at the back of Thomas's neck stood on end as he stumbled from his bed, feeling the strong pull of the chilling call. It was an invitation drenched in dread. He crept over to the window, parting the tattered curtains just enough to peer into the unease of the street below. Outside, the moonless night yawned open, black and inviting, a gaping abyss of fear. Shadows danced menacingly, twisting in sinister forms, with every rustle of the leaves echoing in his heart like a drum, pounding louder with each breath he took. Just as he was about to recoil, he caught sight of something grotesque, a figure cloaked in dark fabric, its shape too elongated and malformed to be human. The monk was there, waiting, just beneath the faintest edge of light cast from a distant lantern that flickered feebly, as if afraid of the darkness surrounding it. His terrifying features remained obscured by the shadowy hood, but the boy felt two burning eyes fixate upon him, darker than the void surrounding them, their coldness wrapping around his heart. Swallowing his fright like a hard bitter pill, Thomas turned away from the window. He gripped the edge of his bed tightly, trembling with the conflict between disbelief and dread. Surely it was just his imagination, a concoction of a mind too easily swayed by stories that played tricks on his youthful thoughts. But the whispers continued, echoing in the corners of his mind. "Come to me, Thomas," they beckoned. "Come to me, child." Sleep became an impossible dream, and the hours ticked by like a clock that had forgotten the meaning of time, each minute stretching his nerves thinner and thinner. The night grew deeper, wrapping around the village like a heavy woolen blanket. He was not alone. The village felt hollow, a forsaken shell of its former self. Even the walls around him whispered curses of fear, remnants of laughter now mere ghostly memories. Suddenly, a loud crash rang outside, breaking through the suffocating silence that clung to the air. Thomas peeked through the curtain again, witnessing a lantern from a neighbor's porch toppling over onto the cobblestone, its light flickering like a frightened little rabbit. Panic erupted across the village as villagers emerged from their homes, eyes wide with fright, faces painted with fear that danced like shadows on the wall. The air was thick with confusion and concern. A cacophony of worried shouts filled the streets while the once comforting hum of the village transformed into an orchestra of panic. Among the chaos and heavy shadows, Thomas spotted the figure once more, lurking in the periphery. The dark monk remained untouched by the fray of terrified villagers. He was a stark silhouette against the flickering flames, a shadow among the shadows, as if reality itself revolved around him and not the other way around. Thomas felt an inexplicable urge to confront the figure. What if he could prove these stories wrong? What if he could show everyone that it was all just a trick of the dark? Gathering his courage, he slipped on his shoes and crept outside, the cool night air washing over him in waves, invigorating yet terrifying. As he took each step toward the figure, it felt as if his feet were weighed down by some unholy force pulling him back, but he couldn't turn away. Villagers rushed past him, their shouts swirling like leaves caught in a storm, yet Thomas was entranced by the dark presence that loomed over him. As he neared the shadowy figure, the darkness seemed to pulse around him, shadows coalescing and forming grotesque shapes in the pale light. The monk's cloak billowed ominously, a swirling mass of dark mists that hugged the darkness. An unholy chill wrapped around him, seeping deep into his bones, like icy fingers that made him shiver despite his resolve. Just as Thomas prepared to shout for help, to warn his neighbors of the danger standing before him, the figure turned towards him. A mouth twisted by unearthly anguish loomed closer, mocking the silence that enveloped them all. "No one can save you now," the monk rasped, voice dripping with malevolent delight, like something out of a nightmare. "Come, child." His voice was low and chilling, igniting a deep-seated, primal fear within Thomas. The boy's heart raced, and suddenly, a terrible realization washed over him. The village had transformed into a labyrinth of horrors, each corner and shadow harboring a sickening ghoul. Shadows clung to the walls like putrid flesh, the air thick with tension and despair. He dared not look away from the figure, for every flicker of the lantern shade seemed to amplify the truth of those chilling stories. The dark monk was real. His courage faltered under the weight of that grim truth. Panic surged within him, chasing away any doubt he might have had about the shadows that haunted his dreams. With every ounce of will he could gather, Thomas turned to run, fleeing back toward the safety of his home, where the familiar creaks and sighs of the house felt like a warm embrace. His heart pounded in his chest like a wild drum. Yet, a chilling realization gripped him tightly. He had taken a step into that realm of darkness, and by doing so, he had marked himself as prey, a warning whisper echoing in the stillness. As he dashed through the cobblestone streets, the night air tugged at him with icy fingers, trying to slow him down. The whispers grew louder in his mind, echoing the sinister call of the dark monk. "Come to me," they repeated, as if mocking his attempts to escape. Desperation clawed at his throat, forcing his legs to move faster, to propel him away from the nightmare that danced in the half-light. Each stride felt heavy, as if the shadows themselves were trying to draw him back. He burst through the threshold of his home, slamming the door behind him with a resounding thud, the sound echoing through the quiet rooms like a plea for safety. The familiar smell of wood and dust enveloped him, yet the comfort was fleeting, for the shadows still lurked on the fringes of his mind. He pressed his back against the door, his breath coming in shuddering gasps as he closed his eyes tightly, trying to force the lingering image of the dark monk out of his mind. "Just a dream," he whispered to himself, shaking his head as if to clear away the terrifying visions. Just a story, but deep down, he knew better. Suddenly, a soft knock sounded on the door, breaking the fragile silence like a crystal shattering on the ground. The echo seemed to vibrate in the very walls. The chill swept back over him, and he swallowed hard. Every part of him screamed to stay silent, to not acknowledge whatever was outside. He wanted nothing more than to curl up in his bed and hide under the covers until dawn chased the darkness away. Another knock, louder this time. "Thomas?" A voice called urgently from the other side of the door. It was his mother, worry threading through her tone. "Thomas, are you all right?" Relief washed over him, mixed with a strange confusion. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts, before he managed to push the door open, revealing his mother, standing there looking frazzled and anxious. "Where have you been?" she asked, concern furrowing her brow as she stepped inside and closed the door tightly behind her. "I heard the commotion outside. It's not safe out there, my dear." I saw him." Thomas breathed, his voice trembling as he recounted the shadowy figure, the foul whispers that had called to him. "The dark monk. He's real, I swear." His mother knelt before him, brushing his hair back from his forehead, her warm hands soothing against his fear. "Sweetheart," she began gently, "I know the stories. They can be so frightening. But they are just that, stories." "But Mom," Thomas insisted, shaking his head fervently. "I saw his eyes, he was right there. He wanted me to go with him." His mother looked thoughtful, her expression softening, but worry clawed at the edges of her eyes. "I understand you're scared, but it's just the tales we've heard coming to life in your imagination. The village has been on edge lately. Perhaps it's time for us to talk about the stories, to share our fears, so you don't feel so alone in them." The night stretched endlessly before him, a tangled web of fear and shadows. Thomas nodded, still trembling, as he settled into the warmth of his mother's embrace. With each word she spoke, the shadows danced less worryingly in his mind, replaced by the comforting knowledge that he was not alone, that perhaps together, they could confront these fearful dreams and turn them into stories of bravery instead. As the night wore on, with whispered tales echoing from his mother's lips, Thomas found solace in the glow of their shared courage. The dark monk would remain a figure of fear, but maybe, with the dawn of a new day, he would also learn how to chase away the shadows and find the light, returning laughter and life to their quaint village, where darkness would no longer hold the power to frighten them. For now, though, he would cling tightly to the warm glow of home, a simple light against the whispering shadows. They would protect him, keep the terrors at bay, and remind him that even the darkest night cannot defeat the dawn's bright embrace. Days passed since that chilling night, but the horror clung to Thomas like a thick fog. When darkness fell, it brought with it whispers that curled around him, relentless and haunting. "Thomas," they called, echoing in the still air. Night after night, sleep slipped through his fingers, leaving behind an emptiness that echoed with fear and dread. The villagers began to notice. Mothers held their children close, eyes glancing warily at the street corners, while fathers spoke in hushed tones, their brows furrowed in concern. Something dark was growing, an unsettling shadow that shadowed Thomas, wrapping around him like a cloak. As days turned to weeks, children began to vanish one by one. At first, no one noticed the soft giggles drifting away, but soon, it became evident. Laughter filled with the joy of youth was replaced by a chilling silence. Families went to bed with heavy hearts, locking doors and barricading windows, staying awake through the night with fear painted vividly on their faces. But no amount of locking up could keep out the night, and only the echoes of their children's voices remained. The village whispered of the dark monk, terrifying stories woven from years of despair and lost innocence. On a sunless afternoon when a heavy gloom hung in the air, Thomas wandered through the marketplace that had once thrived with color and life. Now, the stalls seemed weary, their colors faded and dull, much like Thomas himself. The wind howled through the empty spaces, swirling up debris and sending shivers down his spine. At the end of the worn street, he noticed the empty house, an old structure that had stood for generations, forlorn and forgotten. Its edges were sharp, like jagged teeth, and its windows stared vacantly like hollow eyes. Boys in the village often dared one another to step inside, but the courage always shrank before the fear. Stories of the dark monk wrapped around that house like the vines that grew unchecked in the garden. There was talk of eerie noises and shadows that danced when no one was watching. Yet something inside Thomas stirred. Rather than retreating in fear, an insatiable curiosity tugged him forward. What if this haunted place held the answers he desperately sought? What if the secrets contained within those decaying walls could help find the missing children? Perhaps understanding the truth could snap the village free from the web of terror. Despite the dread pooling in his stomach, he approached the heavy door, which hung slightly ajar, creaking invitingly in the cold breeze. The air inside was stale, heavy with memories long abandoned. Taking a deep breath, Thomas gathered his bravery and pushed the door open. It squealed in protest, sending a shiver down his spine. Beyond the threshold lay a world obscured in shadows. The foyer was dark and draped in dust, a forgotten time capsule steeped in silence. Each step Thomas took made the floorboards groan beneath him, sounding like a low murmur of warnings. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind slammed the door shut behind him, and he felt sealed in the ominous grip of the house. The air was thick with sorrow, pressing on his chest and making it hard to breathe. He could almost feel the weight of history in the walls. They seemed to whisper tales of despair, tales of those who had wandered here before. He walked through rooms filled with shadows and the remnants of lives once lived. Disheveled furniture lay strewn about as though it had been abandoned in a hurry. The portraits on the walls, faded images of people who seemed trapped in their own sorrow, watched him with hollow eyes. He turned a corner and entered a room that was especially eerie, cloaked in shadows that wrapped tightly around him. Old toys scattered across the floor appeared to have been left mid-game, as if the children who once played here had been snatched away. The walls were covered with paintings that depicted nightmarish figures, their faces contorted in expressions of agony. Each painted mouth seemed to scream noiselessly, a chorus of despair that sent chills racing down Thomas's spine. In the center of the room stood an ornate mirror, cracked and lonely. The glass reflected a distorted image of the room, warping the shapes and shadows into something grotesque. Drawn in by the strange allure of the mirror, Thomas stepped closer. As he peered into its depths, he saw not his own reflection but a swirling pool of darkness. Suddenly, from the shadows, a dark figure emerged. It was the dark monk, reaching out with long, skeletal fingers towards him, its eyes burning with an insatiable hunger. A cry caught in Thomas's throat, but he was frozen in place, too terrified to move. The weight of despair was tangible, clawing at him like angry hands trying to yank him into their world. "You should not have come here, boy," the voice sang through the air, soft and sweet, yet laced with a poison that made his stomach churn. Shadows enveloped him, wrapping tightly around his body, whispering his name like a haunting lullaby. The walls began to throb and pulse as if the house itself was alive, made of despair and sorrow. Thomas felt panic swell in his chest. He turned swiftly, desperate for an escape. Fumbling through the corridor, his heart raced like the flapping of a trapped bird in his chest. The world he had known began to warp. The hallways twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the darkness rather than out into the light. He felt lost, like a small spark in a dark cavern, and moments felt like hours as he battled against an unseen force holding him back. Flickering lights came and went, casting shadows that danced chaotically, confusing him further. At last, he reached the front door, the exit he longed for. Thomas burst through it, lungs burning and screaming for fresh air. Yet, standing just outside the threshold was the monk himself, towering and ominous, shrouded in darkness. Thomas felt the air grow cold and thick, pressing down on him like the weight of a mountain. The village, once so familiar, now seemed small and far away, lost in the enormity of fear that had become a living thing. The figure loomed over him, and Thomas felt a strange sense of understanding wash over him. The tales of the villagers were more than just warnings. They were a grotesque truth that had unfolded before his very eyes. Trembling, he understood that the dark monk thrived on fear, feeding on the shadows of lost children and whispered memories. As darkness enveloped him, Thomas faltered and teetered on the edge of despair. But through the haze of fear, a flicker of courage reignited within him. He couldn't let the dark monk win. He glanced down the road, the path leading back to the village where fear should not take root. With a sudden blast of resolve, Thomas whispered to himself, "I can't give up now." He turned and dashed back into the murky gloom of the house, knowing he had to confront what lurked within. Fear might whisper his name, but he would not let it bind him. The missing children needed him, and he wouldn't let the darkness win, not today. Steeling himself, Thomas plunged deeper into the dark heart of the house, determined to uncover the secrets hidden within the walls and put an end to the horror that gripped the village. It was a race against time, and he would face the shadows head-on, for the sake of his friends, his family, and his very soul. After escaping the house, Thomas felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. The night was darker than he had ever seen, and it felt like the village was drowning in a deep sea of despair. The stars were hidden behind thick clouds, their light failing to pierce the gloom that hung over everything. Shadows seemed to stretch out, stretching longer and thicker, and they whispered secrets that filled the hearts of the villagers, secrets filled with fear and worry. Children who previously laughed and played together now crept around the corners, their voices hushed as they shared tales of friends who had disappeared without a trace. It was as if darkness had coiled around their spirits, squeezing joy out of their hearts, leaving behind only fear and doubt. The world felt like a dismal place, and hope seemed to flutter away like a butterfly in a storm. Each night, after the sun sank below the horizon, Thomas found it harder to fall asleep. Fear gnawed at his insides, twisting like a vine that tightened with every beat of his heart. No matter what he did, he couldn't shake the image of the dark monk from his mind. His wicked laugh echoed in the quiet hours of the night, invading his dreams and leaving him restless and anxious. Thomas knew that if he didn't face this terrible being, he would eventually be consumed by the fear that threatened to swallow the village whole. Every night, as the darkness encroached, he worried that someone else would vanish, taken by the curse that the dark monk weaved through the shadows. Realizing something had to change, Thomas felt a surge of determination. He wanted to confront the fears that haunted him, so he decided to turn to the village elders for help. These wise men and women, with faces etched in lines of care and sorrow, had lived many lives and held stories that could shine light in the darkest corners. So, at dusk, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky a mixture of deep purple and orange, he gathered them in the crooked old tavern that served as the heart of the village. A place where laughter once echoed, now filled with worry and whispers. Inside, flickering candles cast long shadows across the rough wooden walls, illuminating the somber expressions of the elders as Thomas spoke. His heart raced and his voice shook, but he knew this was important. "You must listen to me," he urged, trying to sound brave even though his stomach felt like it was filled with butterflies. The elders exchanged anxious glances, each of them recognizing the panic that had begun to grip the townsfolk like a vice, squeezing out every ounce of hope. In hushed voices filled with caution, the elders began to share their own stories of the dark monk, tales passed down from their own childhood, tales filled with chill and fear. "He was once a man," said one elder, his voice an echo of regret, but darkness crept into his heart, consuming him. The other villagers leaned closer, eager for understanding yet frightened by the truths that were unfolding. Forgotten by time, he made a pact with shadows, a deal that turned his heart blacker than coal. Year after year, he returns, seeking to claim what he loves the most, the children. A chill swept over the room, and Thomas felt as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. The stories were no longer just old wives' tales but carried a weight of chilling truth that interwove the fate of the village. He thought of his friends, their innocent laughter now silenced, and he realized that children like him were the very essence of light the dark monk sought to extinguish. The urgency of his mission settled heavily on his shoulders. If he did not act, the darkness would surely consume them all. As night draped its heavy shroud over the village once more, Thomas steeled his resolve. Fear was a powerful adversary, but he was driven by a fierce hope for his friends and family. With every prayer he whispered, simple words of hope and courage, he prepared himself for the confrontation he knew he must face. The sky turned a deep crimson, and shadows coiled thick around him like a serpentine blanket as he resolved to seek the presence of the dark monk. He walked carefully toward the woods, where it was said that children had seen the figure move with the trees, a dark shape dancing amid the branches before disappearing into the night. As he stepped closer, an eerie fog rolled through the village, curling around him like icy fingers intent on snuffing out his spirit. The trees loomed large and twisted, their gnarled limbs reaching out like claws, but Thomas pushed forward, channeling his courage into each step he took. As he ventured deeper into the woods, the mist thickened around him, swallowing sound and light until it felt as if he was walking through a suffocating blanket. The way was treacherous, and Thomas held on to the knowledge of his village, its beauty and vibrancy, as a beacon to guide his path. Suddenly, a chilling laugh echoed ominously through the trees, its sharpness piercing the heavy atmosphere. It was a sound filled with ridicule and malice, and it seemed to taunt him, bouncing off the ancient tree trunks. The dark monk emerged from the shadows, more terrifying than Thomas had imagined. His form seemed to flicker like a candle struggling against a breeze, menacing and cold, and a shiver ran down Thomas's spine. "You dare to come here, little child?" he crooned, the words drifting like smoke. "You should have run while you had the chance." For a moment, fear gripped Thomas, clenching his heart in a vice. But then he remembered the stories shared by the elders, the history of the dark monk, and he swallowed hard, summoning the last of his courage. "I know what you want," he shouted, trying to fill his voice with determination. "You are here to take the children, but I won't let you take anyone else." As he spoke, he grasped tightly to a small silver pendant that hung around his neck, a protective charm given to him by his mother, blessed with love and hope. The dark monk's laughter grew louder, a cacophony of mockery that sent chills down Thomas's spine. "Oh, foolish child," he said, his voice dripping with scorn. "You cannot even begin to comprehend the hunger that dwells within me. It is an insatiable thirst, a void that can never be filled." Clouds of shadow swirled around Thomas, wrapping him in despair, but he fought against it, holding onto his charm as if it were a lifeline. Thomas stood his ground, though doubt clawed at him. The oppressive darkness seemed to press in on him, casting shadows that threatened to engulf him entirely. Still, he refused to back down. "You are strong," he declared, his voice shaking but resolute. "But we will be stronger. I will protect my friends, my village, and I will not allow you to take anyone else." He clutched the pendant, feeling its warmth despite the chill of the night. As the dark monk stepped closer, Thomas felt the weight of his gaze upon him, and the shadows seemed to pulse with life. "Children are so wonderfully innocent," the monk sneered. "It is their purity that makes them so delightful to collect. You think you can stop me? You have no idea how deep my darkness runs." The air around them grew thick, crackling with tension. For a fleeting moment, Thomas stood frozen, the words dancing in his mind. But then, he found his inner strength, the fire of determination flickering bright. "I may not understand your darkness, dark monk," he called out, "but I know the light within us, the love, laughter, and hope of the children. You can't take that away." He raised his pendant higher, allowing its glow to pierce through the darkness. The dark monk hesitated, a flicker of confusion crossing his grotesque features. It was just a moment, but in that moment, Thomas felt a rush of courage. "You cannot claim the children as long as there are those who fight for them," he shouted again, the echo of his voice mixing with the rustle of the leaves. The shadows twisted and writhed, and Thomas's heart raced, fighting against the pull of the dark monk's dark presence. He could feel the whispers of his friends and the voices of his village urging him on, fueling his spirit with courage and strength. He knew he couldn't give in. "I will protect them," Thomas yelled once more, and he took a brave step forward, ready to face whatever the dark monk would unleash. The air crackled with tension as the dark monk glared down at him, the shadows swirling around him like an angry storm. "You think joy can hide from me?" he hissed. "You will learn that despair is my domain." But as Thomas looked into the monk's eyes, he saw not a monster but a specter of loss and sorrow, a painful reality twisted by darkness. "You can't keep this darkness forever. There is always light," he cried, using every ounce of hope and strength he had gathered from his village. And as he stood there, holding the pendant close and watching the darkness swirl around him, a strange warmth filled the air. The flickering light of the pendant grew brighter, illuminating the trees and casting away the shadows. The dark monk recoiled, and for the first time, fear flickered behind the mask of malevolence. "Stay back!" the dark monk shouted, his voice rising in panic. As he tried to retreat, the shadows writhed around him, and in that moment, Thomas felt the tide of despair beginning to wane. Courage surged through him, brightening the world just a little. In that tiny victory, Thomas understood the true battle he was fighting was not just against the dark monk but against despair itself. If he could guide his friends, his village, to hold their hope high regardless of the darkness, then perhaps they could stand strong together. As the dark monk faded further into the shadows, the laughter and joy of children echoed on the breeze like a powerful spell. Thomas knew the battle wasn't over, but he felt a flicker of hope ignite in his heart. The night still lay heavy and dark, but the warmth of courage glimmered within him like a fire that would not be extinguished. With newfound determination, Thomas turned to face the path back home, ready to rally his friends and the village against the dark. The journey to face the monsoon of shadows was far from over, but together, they could stand strong and united, shielded by the light they carried within. The confrontation that had begun in the shadowy grove ignited a bruising battle of wills between Thomas and the terrible dark monk. Thomas soon realized he was deep within the darkness of a realm beyond his understanding. The air around him felt thick and heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, anxious and frightened by what was happening. The dark monk, towering and ominous, exuded an overwhelming aura of despair, a feeling so insatiable and ravenous that it made Thomas's heart race with fear. Shadows around the dark monk reached hungrily towards him, weaving and twisting like monstrous snakes, trying to ensnare him with grotesque tendrils that seemed almost alive. "Do you think you can stop me?" the dark monk hissed. His voice slithered through the air like smoke curling around a flame, dark and sinister. With each word, the forest trembled in response, like a rabbit sensing the approach of a wolf. Even the very earth beneath Thomas's feet seemed to quake under the weight of the malevolence that surrounded them. Branches cracked, leaves rustled, and the feeling of dread hung heavy in the air. In that moment, Thomas felt his heart race not just with fear but with a cold realization. He was incredibly alone. Blinded by terror, he felt a clash of emotions. Fear slapped against his courage, ripping away fragments of his resolve. The dark monk wasn't just a phantom tale conjured in the flickering shadows of bedtime stories. He was real, and the darkness he carried with him was all-consuming. The tales Thomas had heard as a child echoed in his mind, swirling around him like the relentless shadows. The stories had warned about the dark monk, about how he thrived on despair, snatching the innocent from their dreams. The heroic figures of those tales had long faded in the dust of time, having been forgotten by the souls wise enough to flee from the horrors that lurked in the shadows. Now, faced with such a malevolent force, Thomas felt the memories of those warnings tighten around him like a chain, suffocating and immobilizing. For an unfathomable moment, Thomas stood paralyzed, feeling the cold grip of hopelessness close around him like jagged teeth. The chilling tendrils of darkness circled him, pulling him toward the abyss, whispering sweet lies of surrender. "You can give in," they seemed to say. "There's no hope here." He almost gave in to despair. Just as he thought the shadows had won, a flicker of light ignited within him, a spark of defiance and determination. It was an indomitable urge to protect the children that still roamed the village, innocent and full of joy, unaware of the lurking danger. Thomas summoned every precious memory of laughter, joy, and childhood innocence that filled his heart. He thought about the sun shining brightly above the village, the sound of children laughing as they played games, the smell of sweet flowers blooming in the fields, those little moments that made life beautiful. Each image grew more vibrant in his mind, glowing like stars breaking through the night sky, more potent than the darkness surrounding him. "Leave us," Thomas commanded, his voice stronger than he felt. It was an echo of every brave child who had ever faced their fears. The words flowed from him, steady and resolute, bolstered by a defiance he did not know he possessed. As he spoke, the shadows recoiled, shrieking in pain as if a bright light had burned them away, retreating just for a moment. But the dark monk simply twisted his mouth into a cruel smile that seemed to revel in the chaos around him. He was unfazed, a master of the dark arts. "Did you think mere courage can save you?" the dark monk taunted, his voice dripping with malice. "You cannot fight what you do not understand." This only fueled Thomas's determination further. Although fear clawed at his heart and whispered doubts filled his mind, Thomas felt strength rising within him, like the sun breaking through dark clouds after a storm. He realized that while he might not fully understand the vastness of the darkness before him, he understood the power of hope and love. Those were things he could fight for, things he would protect fiercely. The battle of wills continued, and though Thomas dug deep into his courage, he soon felt the last of his light extinguish. It was as if the warmth and hope that had brightened his spirit were being smothered, and the weight of the darkness pressing down upon him was suffocating. Even as he became aware of this despair engulfing him, a chilling realization set in. With a sweeping motion, the dark monk launched a tendril made of solidified darkness into Thomas's chest. It penetrated his being, twisting and curling within him, as if trying to shatter his innocence and fill the empty spaces with dread. Pain split through him like jagged glass, making him feel rooted to the ground as if he could not move or escape. His heart raced with the echoes of despair, each beat a reminder of the light slowly flickering away. Thomas felt the world around him begin to fade. The once lively forest, filled with the sounds of nature, began to dissolve into echoes of haunting memories. He screamed, but no sound emerged from his lips. The darkness absorbed it, swallowing it whole, as if mocking his struggle. Instead, all he could hear was the laughter of children faintly echoing in the trees, a once joyful sound turned mournful. The shadows thickened, growing heavier, and he felt them wrap around his legs, pulling him down into a deep, dark pit. Thomas remembered the faces of the children he loved, their laughter and smiles now mere flickers in his memory. The deeper he sunk into the darkness, the more he felt the strength of defiance fade. It was as though he was being unmade, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but shadows. At that moment, the cruel laugh of the dark monk resounded around him, ringing through his ears like poisoned words. "Welcome, dear Thomas. Welcome to your new home," he sneered. It was a greeting twisted with malice. In that irrevocable moment, the boundaries between light and darkness faded away completely. Thomas felt himself being swallowed by the shadows, surrendering to the chaos that overwhelmed him. Days turned into nights, and the village awoke the next day to find both light and children diminished, their usual laughter replaced with a sorrowful silence. They felt the weight of a new burden pressing upon them, a curse born from the greed of the unholy darkness they had once thought was a mere tale meant to frighten children. The air felt thick and heavy, changing the way they moved around their home, filled with anxiety and uncertainty. The villagers searched high and low for Thomas, calling his name until their voices grew hoarse. Their hearts ached with worry. Where could he have gone? He had always been so brave, always ready for an adventure, but now he had vanished without a trace. It was as though the very shadows of the night had reached out, clawing at him and drawing him into their cold embrace. Days turned to weeks, and with every sunrise, the search continued but to no avail. The dark monk had claimed yet another child. Another innocent soul was lost to despair. Thomas had joined the ranks of those who vanished, and his name became just a whisper carried on the wind, a fading memory in the hearts of those who had loved him. The villagers decided to honor Thomas by telling stories about him not just as the boy who had been lost but as the brave protector of all. They shared tales of his laughter, his kindness, and the strength he brought to everyone around him. They created a small shrine at the edge of the village where children would come to remember him, leaving flowers and notes, a reminder of the light that had once filled their homes. Even as they spoke of Thomas, the dark monk still lingered just beyond the edges of their nightmares, like a dark cloud threatening to rain despair over them at any moment. The tales of his terror continued, spinning a web of fear that ensnared the village. Adults warned their children late at night, urging them to stay close to their homes, to never stray too far into the woods, for that was where the dark monk prowled. He lurks in the shadows, hungry for the light you carry, they would say, wide-eyed, to ensure that the children never forgot the lesson through their play. However, in the hearts of the villagers, there remained a flicker of hope, for they knew that even in the depths of darkness, kindness and love were forces stronger than fear. They understood that though Thomas was gone, his spirit would live on as long as they remembered him. In this way, they hoped to keep the darkness at bay, creating light where they could and giving strength to one another every day. As time flowed on, the village slowly began to heal. Each child grew a bit wiser and a bit stronger, carrying with them the memory of Thomas, who had fought bravely against the darkness. They understood now that light needed to be nurtured and cherished, and shadows would always be there, lurking, but one must always choose to hold onto the light. And so, the villagers made a promise to one another, to tell and retell the stories of Thomas, allowing his bravery to shine brightly in the hearts of generations to come. His name would not fade away, it would be spoken and remembered, though somberly, among the tales that danced in the flickering light of the fires. And while the specter of the dark monk would always linger, they also leaned on each other, determined to stand together against the shadows, ready to defend the light, not just for Thomas, but for every innocent soul still roaming among them.